First of all, for those that were previously here, for letting us intrude your space. This will happen again next Wednesdays. Feel free to have some Strudzelbergen though. For those of you joining us in the back, it is absolutely open. Well, good. Welcome everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Todd Green, the chair of the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. And welcome to the second talk of our Earth Seminar series for spring 2023. We have a great lineup, as you can see. I wanted to show this. We had Ben Parrish and David Root last week. Here we have Dr. Knowles, but well, let me scroll down a little bit. If you check this out, we are almost fully booked. So we have next week, Dr. Monica Arienzo is going to talk about microplastics in the environment, and we're booked all the way to spring break, and then we're really, see, there's about 1 week we're missing, but after that we are going all the way until May 10th. So we'll be here at this time. For those of you that like studying here, 1 to 2 o'clock, we'll be glad to have you as well. Thank you to Dr. Jochen Neuster here, who made the wonderful treats. I'd like to give him a round of applause. Great, authentic German sweets, Strudzelbergen. And if I ever want to make Jochen laugh, all I have to do is say Strudzelbergen. But please. And there's also coffee as well, and some vegan treats as well. Well, good. So I just want to introduce our speakers, Dr. John Knowles, and most of you know him, but not everybody. He is our brand new, relatively speaking, assistant professor in our Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. He's an ecohydrologist, and he's also a native of Maine. And he attended Vassar College and the University of Colorado Boulder, where he received his PhD and discovered ecohydrology as a discipline. And then he by merging his passions for water and for ecosystems. And we're going to hear a lot about that. Most recently came from Tucson, Arizona, where he was a research ecologist at USDA Southwest Water Research Center. And we're going to learn all about evapotranspiration. And we're very lucky to have John on our staff. And I've been begging him to do a talk, and he said yes. I didn't really have to beg too hard. So thank you everybody for being here. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Knowles. Got that going?
No.
Awesome, thank you, Todd. Thanks everyone for coming. I am a second-year assistant professor, and I was one of the people that did my whole job interview on Zoom. So this is kind of like my opportunity to finally give my kind of research seminar that maybe I would have given in person. So I'm going to talk today about ecohydrology. I wanted to start it off by with some recognition of Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, who was a Venezuelan scientist and one of the founders of ecohydrology, one of the scientists that coined the term right around the year 2000, and passed away last fall. And he, literally wrote the textbook. And in the foreword to the textbook, another scientist, Gabby Catul, said that Dr. Rodriguez Iturbe used to frequently start his lectures with this quote, "We don't study," and then he'd say whatever it is they were going to be covering for that day, right? Or maybe it was a keynote to some big academy, or it doesn't matter. But he'd say, "We don't study it because it's important, but because it's beautiful." And so, I put ecohydrology in there for me, right, for today, and because he was an ecohydrologist. And, I thought a good amount about this quote. And to me, it kind of comes down to beauty is something in the eye of the beholder. And when you come across that thing that you find to be beautiful, and, Todd sort of described it for me, like ecohydrology came upon me, and it's almost as if I had no choice, right? Like, I loved it, it grabbed me, and it's not that it's not important, but I just study it just because I think it's so interesting. So, yeah. All right, so what is ecohydrology? Everybody's got a different definition, but fundamentally it's going to be something multidisciplinary with a hydrology component, an ecology or an ecosystems component. And for me, the research that I do is pretty much always going to be at some kind of range of scales, or I'm going to show results today from a lot of different scales. So what that means for me is some things at the very, very small plot scale where I've got a chamber, I've stuck a needle in a tree or something like that, up to the ecosystem scale is where I do a lot of work using a technique to kind of measure the breathing of an ecosystem that maybe a kilometer or something like 2 square kilometers. Up to a watershed scale is a really handy unit for ecohydrology, right? Just because it's self-contained, and often scaling up to the regional scale, right, or the global scale to try to get it right. Who cares about this stuff? Like, if you don't live in my particular watershed, right, is this still important to you? So, a lot of people will define ecohydrology in some way that's some ecological process, transpiration, right? A tree bringing water up, right, which it needs to survive just like we do. That's modified by hydrology, say the amount of water in the soil at that point that's available to that tree, to determine some ecosystem response. How healthy is that tree or that ecosystem of trees, right? And I'm super duper interested in this. And I'm going to show a lot of results from this. But there's another way to think about ecohydrology, kind of going the other way. Some hydrological process, maybe it's the amount of water in a stream, and to kind of think about our same example, there's a tree, like a little straw right there on the stream bank, sucking water out of that stream and transpiring it back out to the atmosphere, right? And that water is then lost from that system. So that's an example of an ecological process that's modifying a hydrological response, right? In this case, the amount of water that's left in that stream is reduced, right? Which trickles down to the amount that we have behind our reservoirs and coming out of our faucets and things like that. So that's where, and I'm interested in this too, right? So that's where, when it comes to me and ecohydrology, I like to think of it as a two-way street. So today I'm going to be presenting relatively equally hydrology that modifies some eco process, as well as ecology that's going to modify some hydrological process with implications either for that ecosystem or for the amount or quality of water in that ecosystem. So I already said it once, you'll probably hear me say it again. Many of you have had class with me. The probably biggest, most recurring thread in my classes is I'm always saying, right, who cares? Like, why am I being paid to stand here in front of you today, right, to lecture about ecohydrology? And so I just, found 4 categories that I think should be convincing to many of you in this room, especially as residents of California, about who cares. There's lots of others, and I superimposed this black circle squiggle because to me they're all interrelated, right? You could start at any of these. I don't have this planned out. You could say climate change is affecting ecosystem health, right? Through, most recently, we're in a drought. I put agro-ecosystems because I've started working in agricultural systems, right? But the framework is the same. Ecosystems with dead or dying trees suck up water the way I just described. That affects the amount that we have in our reservoirs. The amount of water that we have in our reservoirs, the amount of water in the landscape, is going to feed back to how susceptible the landscape is to disturbance, right? To we often think about this type of disturbance, but recently to these reservoirs getting overtopped by floods, right? I mean, it's really like, you can really get creative with this stuff. And of course, more floods, more fires, right, feeds back to climate change, to we're changing lands that have historically been unmanaged to manage, right, and this circle continues, and there's X's and O's to be drawn across this thing. So hopefully we don't lose sight of, right, these kind of motivating factors for why somebody like me is doing the research today. And I just grabbed a few, about a month old now, because it's kind of stopped raining, kind of current, like, where's my mind in terms of current events, in terms of who cares? And the one that I think has really been interesting, especially as a newcomer to California, is this flood and drought emergency at the same time that we had about a month ago, right? And that was ongoing for several weeks. And I feel like if any of you went home over spring break and talked to your folks, and it was environmental science came up, they might have said like, oh, so are we out of the drought? Right? Like, mine did. And it's like, I could do a poll, like raise your hand if you think we're out of the drought, right? It's like, I don't know, there's like a lot of water, but, and part of that has to do with how we define drought, right? Like, is drought the amount of water in Lake Oroville? Which is actually, good news story. Lake Oroville's coming up pretty good right now, so we should all feel really good about that. Or we can think of the concept of ecological drought. I like to relate that to that one indoor plant that we all have that we neglected for like a month or 2 months, and then we poured a whole bunch of water on it, right? And it doesn't necessarily undo the 2 months of neglect, right? So whether or not we're out of the drought, how these floods are interacting with the drought, it really just depends on your frame of view, right? But as California, we tend to get booms or busts, and it creates a lot of really interesting ecohydrological situations. So one kind of the backbone of my research is this method called the eddy covariance method. So I want to take a minute and kind of walk us through this. I'll be showing some results from this. So basically, this is just a zoom in of that. It involves just 2 sensors. There's one kind of looks like a claw, and so it's just a fancy wind sensor, and it uses sound waves to measure the wind, and it measures it in the along wind vector, the crosswind vector, and the vertical wind vector is able to separate out using each of those 3 prongs. And the one behind it, kind of the ball on a stick, is an infrared gas analyzer. And so it's constantly sending out infrared laser, right? It's got a source and a detector, and it can tell how much carbon dioxide or water vapor are the 2 things that I use it for. Or you could set it up for methane or nitrous oxide or other gases are in its path of its sensor, right? How much are passing by at any given time. And so by measuring both of those at really, really high frequency, like a minimum of 10 times per second, right? So they're both up there continuously just measuring all the time. We can quantify all of the carbon dioxide or water vapor exchange in that vertical direction that's exchanged as that wind flow and that's contained in that wind flow as it passes over Earth's surface. And I'll dig into a little bit into the carbon and water cycles as we go. So that's the eddy covariance method. Yeah, just to make sure to kind of bring everybody along. When I talk about the ecosystem carbon cycle, there's 2 really large fluxes that we're talking about. So here's our ecosystem. Carbon coming into the ecosystem, we can think about it as photosynthesis, right? Trees, plants need photosynthesis to survive, or need to grab carbon to survive. And at the ecosystem scale, we call that gross primary production. That's just carbon uptake, photosynthesis by that ecosystem, right? If it's taking up a lot, it's really healthy and it's growing. The opposite of that, remember we're thinking in the vertical direction, is going to be ecosystem respiration. plants, ecosystems, mainly focus on plants if you haven't figured it out so far, breathe out CO2 just like we do. Okay, and that CO2 that's breathed out is a mixture of what's called autotrophic respiration from plants above and below ground, so that's just the plants breathing out, and heterotrophic respiration, which is microbes producing CO2 as they decompose organic matter in the soil, right? Like in your compost pile, produces CO2. So we got this big arrow in of carbon, GPP. We got this big arrow out of carbon, that's respiration. And we use that eddy covariance method, those two sensors, we can directly measure the net, or the sum of those two big arrows, which tends to be a much smaller arrow called the net ecosystem exchange. And so that's just the net, the balance of that big GPP arrow coming in, that big respiration flux going out. And so if that arrow is shown as a two-sided arrow, if the net is downwards, negative, towards the ecosystem, that ecosystem is sequestering carbon over time, right? And from a global change perspective, that's what we want, taking it out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground. If that arrow is going up, the opposite is true, and that ecosystem is emitting carbon dioxide over time. It can be a natural process, right? But an ecosystem can function as either a carbon sink or a carbon source, and many switch in between. And so we can measure that net ecosystem exchange term with our eddy covariance method, and then we can back out through models how much of it came from each of these different sources. And I have this little graphic right here to remind me to say that our instruments always mounted on a tower. It can be a short tower or a tall tower. It just depends on the height of the vegetation. You got to get over the vegetation. So tall tower in the forest. Our data is always going to be representative of some spatial measurement footprint that stretches one-dimensionally upwind, whichever way the wind's blowing. Right? So I'm getting some data on net ecosystem exchange. How is this ecosystem breathing in or out? And it's just always coming from some footprint that usually ranges something like a kilometer out. And the eddy covariance method integrates all the data over this source area to give us that one number of net ecosystem exchange. And so that's where I do a lot of my ecosystem work, right? I use this, and I can measure the entire ecosystem, and I can give you one value to say, hey, this ecosystem is sequestering this amount of carbon, right, on an annual basis, or it's emitting this amount of carbon on an annual basis. All right? See some nodding, that's good. On the water side of things, remember I said that same sensor measures CO2 and water vapor. I think it's a little bit more straightforward, something we're used to thinking about for all of us. Vertical water fluxes, right? This is just the water cycle. Vertical water fluxes in the upward direction are evaporation and transpiration, which is just evaporation from within plants, right, through the stomatal cells on their leaves. And water fluxes vertically coming in would be like condensation or deposition, but that tends to be a much smaller flux that we don't care nearly as much about. So really interested in ecosystem breathing in and out and ecosystem evaporation plus transpiration. Sometimes we call it evapotranspiration, or I might call it ET. All right, this is where like I've been teaching a lot. I want to ask if you guys have questions, but I guess I won't.
I do have a question.
Okay.
So because you just said that, but so you said that the evapotranspiration is typically higher than precipitation? So it's out
No,
of
I didn't
balance?
say anything about precipitation. I said condensation.
Or condensation.
Yeah, much. All right, so I'm pretty new, and you know, one of the reasons for me to give this talk is to kind of introduce myself to everybody. So I have one slide about my PhD. This is it. So I did my PhD at University of Colorado. I set up eddy covariance. There's two towers in the alpine tundra above tree line at about 11,500 feet. Set those up in 2007. They're still ongoing, running today. They're part of the, you might have heard of the Ameriflux network and the Niwot Ridge Long-Term Ecological Research Site. So I update these data yearly. and you can just go on to search, Google Ameriflux, go right there. You can download the latest data, totally open source for everybody to use. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and I think is really awesome. So measuring my carbon fluxes over this tundra, we found out through measuring and through my walking around the tundra with this chamber, right, and other things, that it was just these little small patches of the tundra that were like little small wetlands on the landscape, where almost all the rest of the tundra was kind of dry and crackly, especially during the summer, that seemed like they were behaving a little bit differently. And you can see this is one of the wetlands kind of melting out from snow, that there's these pretty thick and really carbon-rich soils in these wetlands. These wetlands are formed because of areas of discontinuous permafrost on the tundra landscape, and so there's areas where the water doesn't drain, creates these perched water tables, right, and this wet meadow vegetation, and these really different soils. A lot of redox, right, in here for the chemists. And so I actually went out, and this is a different type of chamber that I made, where I sampled carbon dioxide that was being produced in the soil, and I did radiocarbon analysis on that carbon dioxide to see how old it was. And I found, so these wetlands are contributing most of the signal to our whole ecosystem flux, and that just the carbon dioxide being produced in the wetlands was on the order of 100 or 125 years old, maybe. Right, which kind of corresponds a little bit to the Little Ice Age, and through some hand waving, right, we could say that maybe carbon dioxide emissions are rising in alpine tundra, which could have a feedback on climate change, right, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that was pretty cool, but my guess is most people here don't really care that much about alpine tundra stuff. Not focused on that today, but I'm always happy to talk about, and I still work on data from those towers all the time.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you?
I guess we're doing a question format.
Yeah. Did you know anyone who works on like the methane emissions from that?
We've looked and looked for methane in that system, and there's not much. Even in those wetlands, there's a little, right? And we mostly do it from like incubations of the soils and stuff. But if you put a methane detector on that tower, you wouldn't see anything. You'd see very little. That's a great question. Where there's a lot of methane is in California in the ag systems, if you're interested in that. It's a great question. All right, so I'm going to just break down the rest of today into kind of some of the work that I've been doing in montane forests, drylands, like Todd mentioned. I was in Tucson before here, and then kind of what I've got going in California so far. All right, and I'm going to kind of just give more some snapshots of some results. Not going to go too into the minutia, hopefully, of any one thing. And again, happy to talk about all this stuff more. So, montane forests, a system that I'm still working in quite a lot. So this is a study where we took eddy covariance data from 6 different towers and all compared it, see what we could learn. All these data were on that Ameriflux site, right? So that's super easy, low-hanging fruit in some ways. And so here's my 6 towers shown in green on this map. And they ranged, we're here in the southwestern US, along this gradient. So here's temperature on the bottom left, where blue is colder and red is warmer, right? So they span this temperature gradient. Top right is precipitation. Blue is more and red is less. They were all pretty similarly in the blue, right? These are mountain forests, so they're kind of getting a fair amount of precip. But what this one on the bottom right shows is the fraction of that precip that fell during the summer monsoon season, from about July to September, that 3-month period. And I don't know if you can make out the contours, but here's 70%, 60% coming up from that, 50% is the red, 40% is the orange, right? So there was a strong gradient in monsoon precipitation, right, where the southern sites got a lot of summer precipitation, and the more northern sites that even get about the same amount of precipitation or more, almost all of it falls during the winter as snow. So what does that do to that ecosystem's photosynthesis? So here's two of the sites that I'm showing. They're the most northerly or highest elevation two. And what I'm showing here is that GPP, that photosynthesis variable, over the course of a year, and these are average data from, I forget, like 6 to 10 or 12 years per site. I made a typical year. And I've normalized it to the mean photosynthesis for the year at that site, just to get the lines to be on the same scale. And so kind of walking through this, when this is down here at 0, this means the ecosystem's dormant. These are pine forests, right? And there's a meter of snow on the ground, and it's cold, and they're wrapped up for the winter, right? They're not doing anything. Lasts till maybe March or something, and then you get this strong, right? When spring comes, it really comes. You get this strong ramping up of GPP photosynthesis to this single peak, strong maximum in the summer, and almost like a bell curve, right, till it comes back down in the fall and it shuts down again for the winter. So I'd say that was somewhat expected. If we look at the more southerly, the more monsoon-affected sites, we get this much different bimodal or two-peak pattern. And so, two important things. Before we get to the two peaks, you never start at 0. These ecosystems are warmer. Remember that temperature gradient? And so, yeah, they might go dormant for a day or two when a big cold snap and a storm comes through, right? But then it gets right back to 50-something degrees, and they're happy as can be, right, with that moisture on the ground. So they're photosynthesizing all winter long to some degree. Snowmelt, you get this first peak of photosynthesis, and then if anybody's ever spent time in Arizona or New Mexico in May or June, there's the 4-summer drought, right, the pre-monsoon. Severe clear, right? It's dry and it's hot. And so things kind of ramp down a bit before the monsoon comes, and you get that secondary peak to create this bimodal GPP. Okay? So who cares, right? Like, why did I go through the trouble? What we're thinking about this is kind of, what if, we know that things are warming, right? There's no debate about that. Precipitation changes we're a little bit less certain about. But if we just think about warming, and we use this, what sometimes we call a space for time substitution, where we say that things, Colorado and New Mexico, might look a little more like Arizona in the future, then we actually couch this as a good news, the rare good news story for warming, where we found evidence. There's actually, up in this table, this is the mean annual photosynthesis from all the sites, and the top 1 and the top 3 are all in this bimodal category, right? They're actually sequestering the most carbon. They're doing us the biggest ecosystem service as a forest, removing carbon out of our atmosphere, as opposed to these higher elevation Rocky Mountain forests that you might think. And so we said this is good news for the carbon sink in the western U.S., where the forests, these montane forests, are the ones that are taking up almost all of the carbon in the west, right? If you're not on a mountain, you're in a dryland in the west, and you're not doing a lot of good work for the carbon cycle. That if we were to get warming, we would expect this light blue and this light green line to come up in the winter and start being more active in the winter, which is a good news for the environment, at the possible expense of any moisture sort of deficits and reduced photosynthesis during the winter. And then importantly, all in the absence of disturbance, right? And so I think many of us know that's probably not realistic anymore. So I want to just shift gears with the next one. I'm going to be looking at the effect of wildfire on stream flow in this kind of, this is still the southwestern USA, and that's where I'm going back to my two-way street framework, right? So we just said water availability on photosynthesis, and now we're going to say how does fire and burning down some of the forest affect the amount of water in the stream. So this is some work that I did, was led by my colleague Joel Biederman. when I worked at the USDA. And what we're looking at in these panels, this is north central Arizona, so not the Arizona that most of you are thinking about. The Mogollon Rim, the Grand Canyon is up here to the north and west. And the White Mountains, these are some really tall mountains actually in Arizona. They get up over 11,000 feet. And we've separated this study area into two regions, the White Mountains kind of being the higher elevation relatively in blue, the Mogollon Rim being a little lower. The Salt River runs through this. This is the Salt River watershed. In darker blue, you might see it running from east to west. That's the major water source for Phoenix, right? So they care, the people in Phoenix, they care a lot about how much water is going to be running through the Salt River, and they actually provided a lot of the funding for this study. The little blue lines you might be able to see, those are just the headwater streams feeding into the Salt River, right, as it comes down off the mountain in various places. And the thing about this watershed is there was two really, really big fires. There was the Wildfire in 2011 over on the Mogollon Rim, and the Rodeo Chetiskyi fire in 2011 in Arizona, which are the two biggest fires in Arizona state history. And so our idea here was to look at, we did both, looking at a stream before and after it burned to see how much water was in it, right, for several years before and after, as well as streams side by side that either drained the burn area from the non-burn area, to really trying to isolate how does it affect the amount of water in the stream and the timing of that water if you get a big fire in your watershed, which these large mega fires we know are becoming more common. So when you start doing a lot more research in environmental science, you'll get a lot of like, man, it wasn't as easy or as clear as we thought, right? The bottom line for this one is it's complicated. I could run you through, this is kind of our summary figure. This is looking at the lower portion of the basin, the upper portion of the basin, the whole basin, summer on the bottom when they get not much, 20% of annual stream flow or so, winter in the middle when they get most of the water, or the whole year. And we found some trends, right, using our side-by-side and our before and after method where it looks like fire did increase summer stream flow, right? But remembering that summer stream flow is not really that important in these systems. One of our methods maybe showed that fire would decrease winter stream flow, and that was somewhat borne out, right, at the whole watershed, at the whole year scale, where we get some negative arrows, right? Maybe fire has some kind of negative effect on stream flow. Another thing that I'm really interested in all my work is kind of trying to cut through the specifics to get it, what I like to think about process-based information. So what can we learn from this study that we could transfer to other watersheds that might also go through fire, right? That becomes much more of a who cares to a lot more people. And so rather than focus on this, I'm going to focus just on two results that we got from this that I think are much more relevant. And what we're looking at here is the relationship between precipitation and stream flow. 6 graphs showing that same relationship with some white mountains, with the higher elevation white mountains on the bottom, lower elevation Mogollon Rim on the top, summer, winter, and the whole year. And so you might think that stream flow was simply a function of how much precipitation came in that year, right? You get more precipitation, you're going to get more stream flow. And that's how a lot of our models work, right? And these models were developed in pretty wet systems. Well, what we found was that holds when you're either in the winter or the whole year at the higher elevation site that gets a lot of rain, right? You can predict it with a nice line. But if you don't get a lot of precipitation in these systems, such as the summer, or really any time of year at the lower elevation, that you got to get to some threshold value, right? The dry years are shown in red, before that relationship starts to kick in. Meaning, if you're in a dry year and you get 200 millimeters of precipitation, the vegetation's just going to use that. Your stream didn't get the benefit. It has to be until that vegetation demand is satisfied, right? And then you still have something to work with that you're going to start to see that coming out in your stream flow. And so that's kind of an interesting threshold idea. Please don't steal this, that we'd like to follow up on, that we think would be really relevant to dryland systems, right, globally and throughout the West.
What about infiltration rate is changing? It's different in dry years, regardless of vegetation.
Sure.
So instead of saying vegetation is soaking it up, it's just a higher infiltration rate in dry years.
Yeah, I'm glossing over, I mean, the system behaves differently such that there's a threshold. That's all this really shows. And we could dive into the processes and infiltration. And I go to vegetation, but it's all, that's what I mean, this is the crux of what I think about is like the different things and how much this arrow counteracts this arrow.
One other question, John. Are those individual storm events? That's the point?
These are annual, great question. These are annual dry years and wet years shown as circles.
But what do you mean by summer, winter then? If it's
dry summer, each one of the
dry
circles
summer.
is a year's value during a summer, a winter, or an annual.
Dry years and wet years.
This is like 40 summers. So the other cool process, you know, I think that came out of this was, here's the same summer precipitation versus discharge, color-coded dry years and wet years. Here's our inflection point, right, the behavior that I just described. But I'm circling here, and I've filled 5 years, the first 5 years following the fire in this Carrizo Creek, which was one of the ones that was burned. And we found that summer stream flow was way more than expected just for those 5 years before it came back down and joined the pattern again, right? And so this, you know, we didn't dive into the processes for this. We weren't equipped to. But, you know, my mind goes to things like hydrophobicity of soil, right? I think many of us know that fires can create, can really reduce infiltration through the creation of chemical compounds and stuff on the soil, such that with the same amount of precipitation, you might get more water in your creek following the fire. Or I've talked to people and say that soil pores can become clogged with ash. They've seen this. And that can reduce infiltration and more of the water ends up in the creek, right? So this is, again, information that, yeah, we think this holds, but maybe it's modified, right, by like just the years following the fire is different. All right, so that's kind of 2 studies that I've done on pretty recently in forests. So I want to switch gears a little bit into drylands. This is a UAV footage of a site that I worked at called Santa Rita Experimental Rangeland in Arizona. It's kind of near Tucson. Over 100 years of rangeland science. And I think it's beautiful, but for all of you that are saying, you know, okay, I don't know, this looks pretty scrubby, I'm not sure. Drylands, you know, rainforests, we've all heard about rainforests, the lungs of the planet, right? They sequester the most carbon and give us the greatest benefit towards global warming and climate change. Well, this really influential paper and others have, from 2015, others have followed up on this. Drylands are actually responsible for the majority of the variability in that year-to-year global carbon sink. So Amazon rainforests are always doing their part every year, right? But some boom years, drylands contribute quite a lot to this. This year, maybe in California.
No, we're not.
Most years, bust years in drylands, they contribute very little, or they might be a source of CO2, right? So, well, the rainforests are always doing their thing. The reason we have kind of variability year to year in the global CO2 emissions is because of the variability of drylands. So that's one reason that we care about drylands, right, globally. And drylands are like 40% of the globe, right? There's a lot of them out there. So this is some work led by Xian Wan, who's now a postdoc at Indiana University. And this is an example. This is like one of my favorite things to do is, this is supposed to look representing like a eddy covariance tower and a UAV and a satellite, right? All bringing to bear on the same question. And so I'm going to show an example of this. I'll show more. I've already shown some, but it's one of my favorite ways to get at research. I brought this up in class in ecohydrology yesterday. Is if you can bring multiple lines of evidence to bear on one question, right? Including maybe a measurement and a model, or a satellite and a tower, right? You can look not only at the times when the measurements and models agree, which gives us extra confidence in the data during those times that we know what we're talking about, but also the points where they disagree, which those are the gaps in understanding, right? That's what really pushes the science forward, and you can delve into those gaps to more additional experimental development, right? Or model parameterization or something like that. So I'm really always interested in these multi-scale, multi-independent methods study. So as an example, this one we combined eddy covariance towers at all of the colored circle locations, along with satellite remote sensing of the western USA. And the colors on the map correspond to these different ecosystem types that I'll get into. And so, I'm really trying to just, like I said, snapshot these, just without going too fast, but still giving you enough. So I'm going to show a couple graphs from this. This first one, this was a study where we used from April 2018 to December 2019, something like 19 months of data, I think it was. And what these panels are showing, this is just a subset of three of the six satellite indices that we looked at that are all up there trying to measure that GPP term, right? That we can measure directly with the tower on the ground. The tower, though, only covers the ecosystem, so the benefit of the satellites is they can look at the whole globe. So we're really interested in being able to measure that from space. And so here we're looking at R-squared values, amount of correlation, between tower GPP on the bottom, and then these three different indices, NDVI, near infrared vegetation index, and this kind of new one, which is sun-induced fluorescence, which is where these are kind of measures of how the surface reflects, and doing a little bit of multiplying and dividing to get some number. This one is in measurement of energy that's actually emitted from plants during photosynthesis, right? During the actual by the photosynthetic machinery within the plant. So it's kind of an emerging cutting-edge satellite technique, and a little bit of the underlying thought here was, does this one do any better, right, than we've seen in the past? And so kind of this is just looking with insight for the whole 19 months, and I said there's winners and losers in terms of the different satellite products being able to approximate the tower data. The dashed line shows the R-squared, the correlation for all of the points on there. And so for NDVI, it's only like 0.4. And so the satellite wasn't able to approximate the tower data, the real direct measurements, that well. For this near infrared, it was a bit better. The dashed line is the mean of everything, and then the solid line above that horizontal is the mean if you just take out the green evergreen systems. And if you do that, it gets up to about 0.7, so it did a bit better. And the solar-induced fluorescence was kind of in between for that whole mean line, but for it, if you took out these sparse grass and shrub ecosystems where there's a lot of bare ground where it didn't do very well, they're all clustered down here at the bottom, then it captured about 70% of that variability as well of what the tower would look at, that R-squared around 0.7. So kind of interesting comparison there. And then another way to look at it is not across time, right, comparing one ecosystem over the 19 months, but drawing lines connecting all the different tower sites that are in the same ecosystem. So how well does it represent productivity from a closed canopy grassland, an open canopy shrubland, right, or an evergreen forest or something like that. And so I think the takeaway here is the slopes for all of these are pretty comparable for our reflectance-based indices, at least as compared to our sun-induced fluorescence, right, where you get kind of the orange line like this, and then, or the pink line coming to the higher slope, and the green line with an even higher slope than that. So there's a lot of biases, right, in terms of how well this one does for different ecosystem types. And these are figures in scientific journal articles. We could talk about it much longer, but really interesting, I think, to look over time and compare that to space. And so what did we learn? Why do we care? Well, we took those tower-based results, we scaled them up to the whole western United States, and we basically said that solar-induced fluorescence does not do well in, I'll start with this one up here, that solar-induced fluorescence would be expected to outperform the reflectance-based indices in closed canopy, heavy trees and heavy shrub systems, but would not do well in bare ground deserty systems, right? So if you're wanting to approximate photosynthesis in the western US, and you're looking at a forest, we recommend that you use SIF, sun-induced fluorescence, right? People tend to use these willy-nilly. They just grab one, it works, right? We're saying for these systems you might want to use this one, and for these, conversely, these other two reflectances would be expected to outperform SIF in those bare ground, right, deserty regions where there's a lot of bare soil. And so, but then they might have limitations in the forested and the more vegetated sites. So about 25% of the western US, we wouldn't recommend those. And so an example of trying to scale this up to best practice, set of best practice recommendations for these kind of new emerging satellite products that are out there to characterize vegetation productivity. All right, last one, and I think it's slightly lesser before I get into just a little bit of what I'm doing in California. Another thing that you can compare with that I mentioned is models. And a really, really interesting, I think, emerging space in modeling is this concept of attribution modeling. We know that there was a heat wave. How much of the heat wave was caused by human-caused climate change? Right? Isn't that kind of the question that we're all wondering about, right? Would this heat wave have been anyway? Probably, but would it have been as strong? And models right now are just being able to get at that. And so this is a collaboration with a colleague at University of Iowa now, assistant professor. And so we wanted to look at that question during this drought that we were both living in Tucson at the time, right? So we're like, what's going on with this drought? Like, how much of this is climate change? And it's so hot out and dry. So July to October 2020, there was this big Southwest drought. I'm calling it a hot drought because, drought just signifies dry. And we don't know that much about precipitation going forward, but we know that things are getting hotter. So we have high confidence in the increased frequency of hot droughts. And what do we care about a hot drought? Well, here's a map of precipitation anomaly during this few-month period, right, where dark colors mean it was really dry. And what I want to point out is areas outlined in black were record for the whole satellite period. Right, so this was record dry. But for a lot of it, especially centered right here around southeast Arizona and southwest New Mexico, it was, and also but into Great Basin and also getting into like Chico zone, it was also record hot during the record dry. What record hot does is, you might have heard that warmer air can hold more water. And so when it's really, really hot and it's dry, that air is really, really thirsty. And it's trying to pull water actively through physics out of the land surface through that what's called a vapor pressure gradient. And so you can measure how dry is the air by this thing called the vapor pressure deficit. And all of this suffice to say that during the hot drought, almost the entire southwest region was the record vapor pressure deficit, meaning that atmosphere was so dry because it was so hot that it was really seeking to pull any water that was there out of the system and back into the atmosphere where it's gone. So how does it affect things if it's hot and dry, right, when there is a drought? Well, that's where we get into the attribution modeling. So here's what I showed. here is that GPP variable that we've been talking about. Here we're just showing from 2015 to 2020. This is the average. It's year to year over those over this whole region for that 5 years, and the average is shown as the dashed line. 2018 was a really, really big drought, but it wasn't a hot drought. So you see that it did dip down, but in 2020, during this event that we're studying, it came down significantly farther, more than 25% below the mean, shown in red there. And so what Matt's able to do with his modeling is we're looking at a bunch of different variables here: radiation, soil moisture, air temperature, and this atmospheric dryness, vapor pressure deficit variable, as well as the combination of all of them. And so he showed that soil moisture was responsible for, of any one factor, lack of soil moisture was responsible for the lack of ecosystem GPP or regional GPP. But that the vapor pressure deficit, the dryness of the atmosphere, amplified those reductions, right? Pulling out, exacerbating, right? Making worse, pulling out whatever was there to start with, and you lose that as well to make this drought almost maybe 40% worse. And so, you know, again, this is an emerging space, but kind of set to look at how the things that we do know about that we expect to get worse might interact with things that we're already familiar with to kind of in this new climate change world that we're getting into. All right, so my last 10 minutes, I just have maybe one slide each or so about 3 different projects that I've been getting going in California. Been mostly working in ag systems, which I think is sort of no surprise to if you live in Chico. So this is one where we set up eddy covariance towers. First year down at this site. Here's what they look like. These are rice fields, and we set up over a rice field here in the first year, and then kind of more in the heart of rice growing country. Traditional rice land is shown in green on this map up in Colusa County in 2022. And these are rice fields that the farmers have purposefully fallowed, meaning not planted, because you might have heard that it's actually getting more profitable for farmers these days to, instead of growing their crop, sell their water that they would have put on their crop downstream to Southern California and places like that, and just leave their land the way it is. Okay, that's how much water is valuable right now. So there's one problem with that, which is the water on the rice fields, and most of you guys know that when rice is watered, right, they use flood irrigation. So it's this shallow lake, essentially, that's created for several months. Has become essential migratory bird habitat along what we call the Pacific Flyway, which is from Alaska to California, right? Every year, birds travel that route, and specifically waterfowl, right, that need shallow water for feeding and habitat and things like that. So if the farmers start selling all their water, which they've started doing, or a lot of them are doing, there's no more water, right, for the birds. And so this is some work funded by the Nature Conservancy, right? They're interested in preserving that habitat, and the idea is right now, status quo on the top, you can get, there's this kind of exchange rate, 3 acre-feet of water per acre of land. That's what you can sell. Well, and you get paid for that, right? And you've made your money as your farmer for the year. What Nature Conservancy is proposing is you still sell some of your water, but you leave enough behind to water the fields just for a month or so in September, or August, September, when it's really strategic for the birds. And so where you used to get maybe 3 acre-feet per acre, you sell like 2.3 acre-feet per acre, and leave behind the rest of that for habitat. And they're confident that they could fill the deficit, right? The farmer needs to still make as much money, or they're not going to go into this program. they could fill that deficit with some combination of public or private investment, right? For people, Ducks Unlimited and towns and people that care about birds. And so they were interested in us to come out there, measure with our eddy covariance tower the amount of evaporation coming off this fallowed field that they flooded strategically for like a month, or we're just experimenting. This is work with California Department of Water Resources. How much evaporation came off that land, and we'll give them that number, and that's how much they would propose to reduce that exchange rate back to the farmers by, right? So I could show you some results. This is actually with 2 years. It is something like the 0.6 to 0.8 acre-feet per acre is what we're coming up with. And we only care about evaporation because think about the water cycle. The rest of that water, right, should make its way back down into the aquifer, into our streams, or something. It's something at some point. It's not lost from the system. So a pretty cool evaporation idea. Another one on the carbon side of things. This is a flux tower that we got going in Blythe, California, which is on the Arizona border, and Southern California in November. And so the idea here is I'm really interested in regenerative agriculture, essentially the idea of carbon farming. And I love it because it's something that the farmers can do, that they can get better yields for their crops, right? Because you don't lose as much nutrients and stuff from the soil and water from the soil. And they can make more money, and it's better for the environment, right? When you till up a whole field, you release all the good stuff into the atmosphere, right? And that land turns kind of to crap after a few decades, unless you dump a whole bunch of synthetic fertilizers on it. So many of you, if you haven't heard about regenerative or sustainable agriculture, I think you will. I think it's something that a lot of people can get behind. And we've got this idea kind of coming from this Kim Novik's really great paper last year of a paired tower approach. So you got one tower on the conventionally farmed field, one tower on the regeneratively farmed field right next to it, making sure that your footprints of your measurements stay on that field and they don't overlap, and you turn them on and you start measuring. And you can measure differences in that GPP, that carbon sink or source over time, right? And if you do that and you do it in as many different systems as you can, over time you quantify that delta or that difference, and you can combine it in with models and stuff to essentially give predictions to people like the government, the state or federal government, that if you were to change this type of system to regenerative farming, here's the potential carbon sequestration that you could reap the benefits. So we're trying to be a part of this. We got this one system going in the Palo Verde Valley. We're trying to get funding to get one more in the San Joaquin and another in the Sacramento Valley, kind of California's 3 major ag areas, to look at the benefits of regenerative agriculture practices. So reduced tillage, right? No synthetic pesticides, a whole bunch of 3 or 4 main things that constitute regenerative agriculture. And then last one is here at the farm, we're working in the almonds. We set up Beyonce, who's right here, which is the breathing ecosystem, y'all. Optical near surface camera equipment hyperspectral system. This is name coined by my colleague Troy Magny at UC Davis. This is a collaboration with UC Davis and the Almond Board and some money that we got from a Cal State ARI grant. He also has T-Swift and Cardi B. He's the acronym king for his measurement systems.
Gonna get sued.
So here's Beyonce, right, measuring at the farm. It's essentially a security camera that we can program to look at individual trees, like repeatedly in a cycle throughout the day. And it's got this hyperspectral camera mounted to it, which allows us to calculate these various indices of GPP and primary productivity. How well are the almonds doing, right? Focusing on a subset of trees and measuring, monitoring continuously. So my grad student right here, Jay Thomas, is working on this, and again, some folks at Davis. The tower's coming back this spring. This is going to be a multi-year campaign. They're doing a drought treatment on some of the almonds, see whether stressing them is bad, or whether maybe it's not bad, and they can save some water that way, right? And by using the hyperspectral camera. This is kind of our latest, greatest, really getting into the plant physiology, right, of how these plants work. It's a really the best direct measurements that we have at this point. So anyhow, that's what I've been up to. I appreciate it. My office is right over here, and if you see me in the hallways, please always feel free to talk, say hi, introduce yourselves, and it's been a pleasure to do it.
All right. Excellent, lots to think about. If there's any questions, we could grab one or come up and talk to Dr. Knowles at your leisure.